My name is Lenora Quinn. I was 26 when the phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and everything my family had built out of silence finally cracked open. I remember the details the way I remember details in a courtroom, clinically in order because that is the only way I know how to survive a shock. The ringtone. The static hush of the wind through my apartment window. My mother's voice, too fast, too high, saying my name twice before she said anything else. Lenora. Lenora. Honey, I need you to come to the Fairview intersection right now.
I didn't ask why.
Mothers who sound like that don't need to be asked why. When I arrived, the streetlights threw long orange smears across the wet asphalt. My sister Dana's car sat crooked against the curb, one headlight shattered, steam curling up from beneath the hood. A man lay on a stretcher being loaded into an ambulance, his leg braced, his face pale under the paramedics' lights. He was alive. I made myself notice that first, he was alive, awake, blinking. That single fact was the only mercy in the whole scene. Dana stood apart from it all, arms wrapped around herself, mascara tracked down her cheeks.
She didn't come to me.
She looked at our mother instead, the way she always had, waiting to be told what to feel. My mother pulled me by the sleeve into the shadow between two parked cars, her fingers digging into my arm hard enough to bruise. "Just say you were driving," she whispered. "Please, Lenora. Just say it was you. Dana can't. She can't have this on her record. Not now, not with the wedding, not with everything." I stood there in the orange light and let the request settle over me like cold rain.
She did not know.
In the chaos of Dana's engagement party, her new fiancé's family, the caterers, the seating charts, in all of it, my mother had genuinely forgotten what I did for a living. Forgotten that 8 months earlier I had been confirmed to the federal bench, the youngest woman in the circuit's history to hold that seat. Forgotten, or never quite let herself absorb it, because absorbing it would have meant treating me as something other than the quiet, useful daughter who solved problems and asked for nothing. "Mom," I said very evenly, the way I speak when a courtroom is about to hear something it does not want to hear. "I am a federal judge." She blinked at me like I'd spoken in another language. "I took an oath," I said. "I can't lie to a police officer at an accident scene. I won't." Her face did something I will spend years trying to forget, a flicker of genuine confusion, as if my integrity were the unreasonable thing in this equation, an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted for. Behind her, Dana had already started crying harder, and I understood, with the flat clarity of exhaustion, that the tears were not for the man being lifted into the ambulance. They were for herself. I walked toward the police officer taking notes near the wreck, and for the first time in my life, I did not look back to see if my mother approved. Before I go further, you should understand what her house was like, because a house teaches you long before an accident does. We grew up in a narrow two-story on Larkspur Avenue, the kind with a kitchen window that fogged in winter and a porch step that always groaned under the second footfall. My father left when I was 9 and Dana was 6, and after that, my mother built her whole remaining life around Dana, the way you build a shrine around the one thing you're afraid of losing next. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it the way I'd say a fact into a court record because it happened and it shaped what came later. Dana was luminous in the particular way some children are. She laughed loudly. She performed for rooms. She made people feel like the party had started the moment she walked in. I was the other kind of child. Quiet, watchful. I did my homework at the kitchen table while my mother did Dana's hair for dance recitals, and when my report cards came home with straight A's, my mother would glance at them the way you glance at a utility bill. Acknowledged, filed, forgotten. There's a photograph I still have, tucked in an old journal, of the two of us on the porch steps the summer I was 12. Dana is mid-laugh, gap-toothed, sun in her hair. I am half a step behind her, looking at the camera like I am trying to memorize how to be looked at that way. I used to believe it didn't matter. I told myself that attention was not love, that being unseen was not the same as being unloved, and that I would simply build a life so undeniable that no one could look away from it. That was, I think now, both the healthiest and the most desperate thing a child can decide to believe. So, I studied. I worked 3 jobs through law school. I clerked for a judge who told me in my first week that the law was the only family that never played favorites, that on the bench, everyone stood on the same uneven ground and was made, briefly, equal. I believed him. I still do most days. My mother came to my swearing-in. She wore a navy dress and sat in the third row and cried during the oath, and for one afternoon, I let myself think something had shifted. But by dinner that night, the conversation had already drifted back to Dana's engagement, the venue deposit, the difficult mother-in-law. My appointment to the federal bench was mentioned once, in passing, the way you'd mentioned that the weather had been nice.
I did not resent her for it then.
I told myself it was simply the water our family had always swum in, and you don't blame the water for being wet. I would understand, much later, that the water had a name. It was called being asked without ever being asked, to disappear quietly, so someone else could be the whole of the room. The man's name was Elias Marsh. He was 41, a contractor, walking home from a hardware store with a bag of copper fittings when Dana's car clipped him at the crosswalk. He suffered a fractured tibia and a concussion. He would recover. The doctors were confident of that within the first week, but recovery is not the same as untouched, and I never let myself forget that a human being had been broken because my sister was texting at a red light that turned green before she looked up. I gave my statement to the responding officer that night, honestly, without embellishment. I had arrived after the collision. I had not been driving. My sister had been driving. That was all there was to say, and I said it in the plain, unshowy language I use for depositions, not to protect myself, but because the truth doesn't need decoration, only accuracy. What followed over the next several weeks was not a courtroom drama. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to survive. My mother stopped calling for 4 days, the longest silence between us in years. When she finally did call, it wasn't to apologize. It was to tell me, in the careful, wounded voice she used when she wanted me to feel the size of my own selfishness, that Dana's fiancé's family had heard things, that the wedding planning had become impossible, that I had made a private family matter into something that would follow Dana for the rest of her life. You could have just said you were driving, she said. No one would have known. You don't even drink. You have a clean record. It would have disappeared for you, Lenora. It never disappears for her. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked out at the city lights past my kitchen window, and I felt something in me go very still. Not angry, not yet, just still. The way a room goes still right before you understand a decision has already been made inside you. It would not have disappeared, I said. It would have moved.
From her to me.
That's not the same as gone. That's just a different person paying for it. You always do this, she said. You always make it about principle, when it could just be about family. I wanted to ask her, very simply, when has it ever been about me? But I didn't, because I already suspected the answer would be delivered as an accusation, and I was tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, of being made to feel guilty for the one time in my life I had put myself in a story instead of narrating everyone else's. Dana, for her part, never called at all. Not to thank me for not testifying against her. Not to apologize to Elias Marsh's family, as far as I ever learned. Not to ask how I was doing, alone in a city 4 hours from home, absorbing the particular loneliness of being the family's disappointment for the crime of telling the truth. I let the silence sit. I did not chase it. For the first time, I let quiet be quiet, instead of rushing in to fill it the way I'd filled every silence in that house since I was 9 years old. There is a drawer in my desk at Chambers where I keep things I write and never file anywhere, not motions, not opinions, just fragments. In the weeks after the accident, I wrote my mother a letter I never sent. I told her about the porch photograph. I told her about the report cards. I told her that I understood, on some adult, forgiving level, that a parent raising 2 daughters alone, terrified of losing the bright one, might unconsciously build her whole attention around the child she was most afraid of failing. I told her I didn't hate her for it. Then I told her the thing I had never said out loud, that I had spent my entire adult life becoming someone extraordinary specifically so that she would finally have no choice but to see me, and that watching her forget, in the middle of an emergency, that I was a federal judge, had not surprised me nearly as much as it should have. That was the part that frightened me most. Not that she forgot. That some old, small part of me had expected it. I never sent the letter. I told myself it was because it would only hurt her, but the truer reason, the one I only admitted to myself on a long drive one Sunday with the radio off, was that I was afraid sending it would change nothing. That I would hand her my whole unhealed childhood on a single page, and she would read it the way she'd read my report cards. Acknowledged, filed, forgotten. Instead, I did something smaller and, I think now, more honest. I called Elias Marsh's attorney, not as a judge, which would have been improper, but privately as a private citizen, and I asked, through appropriate channels, whether the family needed anything that wasn't being met by the insurance settlement Dana's policy was processing. I learned that Mr. Marsh had lost 3 weeks of contracting work and that his wife had been driving him 40 minutes each way to physical therapy in a car with bad brakes. I paid for the brake repair anonymously through a local shop, using an account that could never be traced back to Dana, to my mother, or to the case itself. It was not restitution. It was not even close to restitution. It was simply the smallest true thing I could do in a situation built almost entirely out of things left undone. I told no one. Not my mother. Not Dana. Certainly not Mr. Marsh, who deserved dignity. Not a stranger's guilt delivered to his doorstep like an apology no one had the courage to sign their name to. For the first time since the accident, I slept without the tight, coiled feeling in my chest. Not because I had fixed anything, because I had finally acted from the part of myself that wasn't waiting for permission. 6 weeks after the accident, Dana finally called. She didn't apologize, not directly. Dana's apologies had always arrived sideways, wrapped in something that sounded like vulnerability, but functioned like a request. I just feel like everyone's mad at me, she said. Like I'm the villain in some story you and Mom are telling about me. No one's telling a story about you, I said. I gave a true statement about a car accident. You could have helped me, she said, and her voice cracked in the specific, practiced way it always had when she wanted the conversation to bend toward her. You're a judge. You know how these things work. You could have made it easier. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I turn over an argument I suspect is built on a false premise. Dana, I said, do you understand that what you're describing is asking me to misuse a position I earned through 15 years of work in order to protect you from the consequence of checking your phone at a red light? Silence. I'm not angry that you made a mistake, I continued. People make mistakes. I'm asking you to sit with the fact that your first instinct and Mom's first instinct was to hand the mistake to me. Not because it made sense. Because it's what we've always done. You get to be the story. I get to be the solution. That's not fair, she said, but her voice had gone smaller, less certain. No, I agreed. It isn't. It wasn't fair when we were kids, and it isn't fair now. I just finally decided I wasn't available for it anymore. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she'd ever been asked to have one. We didn't fight. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about a screaming match or a slammed door. It was quieter and, in its way, sadder. Two sisters on a phone call, for 100 miles apart, realizing they had been cast in the same family drama their entire lives and had simply never read each other's scripts. Before we hung up, Dana said one true thing, the only one in the whole conversation. I don't know how to be anything other than the one everybody worries about. I believed her. I think it was, in its own accidental way, the closest she'd ever come to seeing me, by finally admitting she didn't know how to see anyone but herself, including the version of herself our mother had built. I want to tell you that the story ends with a dramatic family reckoning, everyone weeping around a kitchen table, decades of imbalance corrected in a single scene. It doesn't. Real repair, when it comes at all, comes in smaller currency than that. What actually happened was this. I stopped answering my phone on the first ring for my mother's calls. I let some go to voicemail. I began, for the first time in my adult life, choosing when to be available rather than making myself perpetually reachable in case someone needed me to solve something. It was terrifying at first, the same specific terror I imagine a person feels putting down a heavy bag they've carried so long they've forgotten their arms could be empty. I kept expecting the ceiling to fall in, for my mother to finally, formally choose Dana over me the way I'd always privately feared she would if I ever stopped being useful. Instead, something quieter happened. My mother called less, but when she did, the calls started to be not different exactly, but occasionally, unexpectedly, about me. She asked, once, what a typical week in chambers looked like. She asked whether I'd need a dress for something called a judicial reception, a detail she'd apparently absorbed from somewhere and filed away without my noticing. I don't think she transformed. People rarely do, not completely, not at 58 after a lifetime of leaning one direction. But I think some part of her, maybe the part that stood in the orange light of that intersection and heard her elder daughter say, "I am a federal judge," in a voice that would not bend, had to recalculate quietly who I actually was, separate from who she'd always needed me to be. I did not need her to apologize for me to feel the shift. I had spent so many years waiting for a formal reckoning, a scene, an acknowledgement delivered on schedule like a verdict. What I got instead was smaller and, I came to believe, more real. The occasional question. The slow, halting redirection of attention. Not restitution. Just the first uneven steps of being seen. 9 months after the accident, I received a letter at my chambers, official, addressed to my title, forwarded through the proper channels. It was from Elias Marsh. He wrote that he'd fully recovered use of his leg, that he'd gone back to contracting work in the spring, that somewhere in the paperwork of the settlement, someone, he didn't know who and the shop wouldn't say, had quietly paid to repair his wife's brakes, and that the mechanic had told him only that it was already taken care of. He wrote that he didn't know why he was telling a judge this, except that he'd looked up my name after the accident, out of curiosity, and had read a little about my work, and something about the letter he wanted to write kept insisting on being sent to me specifically, though he couldn't say why. He said the accident had frightened him in ways he hadn't expected, not the injury itself, but how arbitrary it had felt, how one distracted moment on a stranger's part had nearly ended something. He said his daughter had started walking him to physical therapy some days, holding his arm the way you hold someone you've realized you could have lost. I read that letter more times than I will admit. I never told him the brakes were mine. Some gifts are only real if they stay unsigned. I wrote him back, briefly, appropriately, within the bounds of what a judge may properly say to a person tangential to a case her family was involved in. I told him I was glad he'd recovered. I told him that I hoped his daughter knew how much her care meant. I did not tell him anything else, because the rest wasn't his to carry. It was mine. That letter, more than anything my mother or Dana ever said, felt like the true resolution of that night at the intersection. Not a scene of confrontation. A stranger's small, uninstructed kindness, arriving in an envelope, reminding me that decency doesn't need to be witnessed to be worth doing. Last spring, I went home for my mother's birthday. Dana was there with her husband. They'd married 8 months after the accident. In a small ceremony, none of us discussed the reasons for keeping small. The porch step still groaned on the second footfall. Someone had finally fixed the fogged kitchen window. At some point in the evening, my mother found the old photograph, the one of Dana laughing on the porch steps, me half a beat behind her, looking at the camera the way a child looks at something she's trying to memorize how to be seen by. She held it a long moment. "You look so serious in this one," she said, almost to herself. "I was watching," I said. "I did a lot of that." She looked up at me then, and something crossed her face I hadn't seen before. Not quite an apology, because my mother has never quite had the vocabulary for one, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The particular ache of a parent glimpsing, decades late, a version of her child she'd never quite let herself look at directly. "I should have watched you too," she said. "It wasn't everything. It wasn't the reckoning I used to imagine, the courtroom clean moment where the record is finally, formally corrected. But I have learned in the years since that intersection that most of what heals a family doesn't arrive as verdict. It arrives as small, late admissions, offered without fanfare, easy to miss if you're still waiting for the dramatic version." I didn't need her to say more. I had already built, brick by unglamorous brick, a life that did not require her permission to be real. The oath I took the day I was sworn and had asked me to stand equally with every person who ever entered my courtroom, regardless of who they were or who loved them best. That night at the intersection, I had finally, quietly, extended that same equal ground to myself. I put the photograph back in the drawer where my mother kept the family's small archive of half-remembered years. Outside, the porch light flickered on as the evening settled, and for once, I did not feel like the girl standing a half-step behind, waiting to be fully seen. I already was. I had simply stopped needing anyone else to notice first.